Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is mend. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear mend used is to mean to repair something that has been broken or damaged. As I thought about this verb and what I was going to say about it in this video, I was thinking about the times where I've heard mend use. And I feel like many times it's been in connection to the action of sewing. So using needle and thread to repair something. But it doesn't have to be. Again, just a little bit of my experience with this verb. A second way you'll hear mend used is to mean to heal or to return to good health. So, we're going to talk about this a little later and see some examples where you might hear mend use. And perhaps you've heard a medical professional talk about someone mending or someone recovering from a particular injury or illness. A third way you'll hear mend used is to mean to improve an unpleasant situation. And many times, this unpleasant situation is sort of like a bad relationship. So you might hear about people who've had some kind of disagreement, a fight, right? And eventually, maybe they start talking, maybe there's an apology, something that improves that situation. You should know that mend is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form mending. The past tense and participle form of this verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb mend ends in a d sound. What this means is that when I add the past tense ending, I'm going to add an extra syllable to this word. So when I pronounce the past tense and participle forms of the verb, it should sound like this. Mended, mended. So that ed is making an id sound. Now, you might be happy to know no additional phrasal verbs for us to discuss or new meanings for us to memorize. So let's move on and practice using our verb of the day, mend, in a couple different verb tenses. Today, we'll practice the simple present and the present perfect. Let's start with the simple present. We use this verb tense to talk about habits and routines. We also use it to discuss facts. And in my experience with students, the most difficult thing to remember is how to form the verb here in the simple present. So we need to pay attention to our subject. In the affirmative or the positive, if my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm just going to use the base verb. Okay, no special endings. However, if my subject is he, she, or it, then I'm going to add an S to the end of this verb. And you can see that in my example sentence. The grandmother mends all of her grandchildren's socks. So here I've got one woman, one person, right? So that's why you can see the S there. If there were multiple people repairing socks here, right, then I wouldn't need it. Okay. Now let's take a look at making negative sentences in the simple present. Again, I need to pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use do not and then the base verb. Now, if my subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use does not and then the base verb. You might also hear the contractions don't and doesn't. But the thing I always like to point out to students is that I am not adding an S to the end of the verb in the negative. Okay, so let's take a look at my example sentence here. Sorry doesn't mend all wounds. So this might go back to that third definition, improving upon a bad situation, an unpleasant situation. And what this sentence is saying is just the mere act of saying I'm sorry. It doesn't fix things. It doesn't improve the relationship here. So sorry One word, right? That's like saying an it. That's why you see doesn't mend in that particular sentence. Now let's talk about making a yes or no question in the simple present. To do this, I start with do or does, whichever form matches my subject. That subject comes next, and then the base verb. So again, notice I'm not adding an S to the end of the verb when I'm making a yes or no question. I am only doing that in the affirmative. Here's another example sentence. Do you mend your clothes or just throw them away? Right? So here someone is asking, if you get a hole in something, right? Do you try and fix it or do you just throw away that article of clothing? Now, let's move on and talk about the present perfect. Sometimes we use this verb tense to talk about an action that started in the past and continues into the present. We might also use it to discuss something that occurred in the past, but at an unknown time. Many teachers and textbooks will call this the indefinite past tense. Now, as I make present perfect sentences, I need to pay attention to my subject. If the subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have and then the participle form of the verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, then I'll use has and the participle form of the verb. An example of this might be, the country has mended its ties with neighboring nations. Now, I was a little nervous to put exact names of countries in this example sentence because one, it could be quickly outdated. It seems like there are always some disagreements, and two, I didn't want anyone to feel like I was maybe picking on one country as having maybe many bad relationships or things that needed improved upon. So here we can just kind of imagine one country having some difficult relationships, challenging relationships. Maybe there have been disagreements, right? But eventually, maybe there are some talks, perhaps again some apologies that lead to an improvement upon their relationship. Okay. Now, let's take a moment to look at making negative sentences in the present perfect. To do this, I pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, I use have not and then the participle form of the verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use has not and then the participle form. Again, you might hear the contractions haven't and hasn't used. I've used a contraction in my example sentence. His ankle injury hasn't mended. Okay, so I know this sentence is a little vague. We don't know what kind of injury uh, this person has had, but we know that his condition is not improving. Maybe it hasn't changed, it's just kind of stayed the same. Now, let's take a moment to look at a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, I start with have or has, then I place my subject, and then the participle form the verb. Here's another example. Have they mended their friendship? Okay, so perhaps this has happened to you where you have someone you're friends with, maybe there's some kind of disagreement, an argument, something like that. You're maybe not friends for a period of time, but eventually your relationship improves and you sort of work through that unpleasant situation. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words and phrases that are related to our verb mend. And the first word we're going to discuss today is just the noun form of this word. So, the noun mend is spelled in exactly the same way and it has the exact same pronunciation as the verb. Generally, when this noun is used, it's referring to some type of repair that has been made. Again, most of the examples I saw of this was referencing fixing clothes. So, an example of that might be these mends bring new life to old clothes. Some people intentionally seek out things that are a bit older and look for ways maybe to fix old rips, tears, maybe other damage, and make it like new. Now, there are some phrases you might encounter with mend. The first we'll discuss today is to mend fences. Generally, what this means is, again, we're back to that definition about our relationships and kind of improving, working from some kind of unpleasant situation. So, might think of it as sort of making peace with someone after you've had some difficulties in the past. So, again, this could be disagreements, could be arguments, maybe there have been fights. An example of this phrase in a sentence is she's finally mended fences with her former supervisor. So we can kind of imagine, right? Something bad happening at work, right? And maybe people go for a period of time where they're like, I'm not talking to that person, right? But eventually, something leads to their relationship improving. So that's a phrase you might encounter. The next one and last item we're going to discuss today is something I think far more common to hear, and that's the phrase on the mend. Generally, this means someone or something is improving or getting better. It's pretty common to hear this in connection to people's health, like the question I have on the screen, is your mom on the mend after her surgery? Right? So, is she healing? Is she improving, recovering from that particular procedure? Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.